Hello, my name is David Bradbury. I'm the head of the Tax Policy and Statistics Division of the OECD Centre for Tax Policy and Administration. I'd like to take the opportunity to welcome you all to the OECD Education and Skills webinar on Taxation and Skills. And today we'll be presenting the tax policy study recently released by the Centre for Tax Policy and Administration on Taxation and Skills. And I'm very pleased to be joined by two of my colleagues. I have Piers O'Reilly, who is the tax policy economist from the Centre for Tax Policy and Administration, who has been the principal author of this piece of work. And I'm also very pleased to have with us Deborah Rosevear, who is the head of the Skills Beyond School Division of the OECD's Directorate for Education and Skills. Now, in terms of a few housekeeping matters, it's worth just pointing out that throughout the course of the webinar, if you do have any questions, please feel free to send those questions through to Eric Magnuson. And Eric will direct those questions to us, and time permitting, we'll try and get to those questions later in the proceedings. Can I also just foreshadow that the webinar is being recorded and that will be placed up on the website, and also we will be making the slides available through another link. Both of those links will be tweeted to you after the proceedings, so watch out for that, and all of the information will be available for you. Without further ado, I'd like to commence the webinar by briefly introducing the item before handing over to Piers. Now, the background to this study and its background does go back a few years. I should take the opportunity to acknowledge Carolina Torres and also Bert Brees, who have been involved in this project throughout. Carolina was involved in the first instance in developing some of the modelling. Bert has been involved in the project throughout, but Piers, who you will be hearing from shortly, has been the one that has taken the project through to its completion. In terms of the background, this is very much about trying to understand how this piece of the puzzle fits into the overall question of how do we design tax systems that support inclusive growth. And the taxation of human capital and the incentives that are in place as a result of the tax system to drive that investment is something that has been very much the focus of this work. And many of you would be very much aware with the history. There is a vast amount of literature out there on the tax rates on physical capital and the various studies that have been undertaken there. But there really has not been all of that much attention on this question of investment in human capital and how the tax system plays a role in either incentivizing or placing disincentives in the way of that investment. And that's the focus of this work. In terms of some of the key questions that this piece of work seeks to answer, we go very much to the question of what are the effective tax rates on human capital and skills investments. And then that is a very much a central question that needs to be asked and answered as a prerequisite to then considering whether or not we're getting the mix right when it comes to an investment in both physical and human capital. Of course, it is always important to remember that physical and human capital are complementary. Investments in physical capital often need skilled labour to deliver higher returns and increased productivity. And I think that it is worth noting that a very big part of the motivation for this work is an acknowledgement of the increasing importance that skills will play in the knowledge-based economy of today and tomorrow. And it's in that context that I'd now like to hand over to Piers, who will take us through some of the detail of this study.
Thanks very much, David. So with this study, we covered 29 OECD countries and built a series of indicators trying to examine the impact of the tax system on financial incentives to invest in skills, and also how the tax system distributes both the cost of skills and the benefits of skills between the students making the skills investment and also the government, who's a co-financer of the skills investment. We focus on wages, as being the key returns to skills, and we try and look at how the tax system shares those returns between students and governments. And I should say that we focus on the personal income tax system. There's other taxes at issue with respect to labor income and labor supply, like social contributions. We don't focus on those so much in this study. And what we do is we try and simulate for a series of examples financial costs and returns to skills, and use these simulations to calculate a series of indicators that I'll present later on that look at the various financial incentives and financial costs and benefits of skills investments for students and governments. So what are the kinds of things that we take into account in the study? Well, we look at the direct costs of a skills investment, so things like for students, things like tuition fees, books and materials, and also for governments, whatever spending they're doing, for example, on universities or on adult education, or grants or scholarship income that they're paying out to students who may be undertaking skills investments or getting an education. But we also, because we're focused on tax in this study, we also look at how the tax system apportions the costs between students and governments. So something that's really important to understand is that when students make skills investments, when people invest in education, a key part of the cost is lost earnings. Because it takes time to study, people aren't able to work, and that presents costs for individuals because there's lost wages, and also there's costs for governments because when people aren't working, governments aren't getting that tax revenue, and so that's a key cost for governments. And one of the things that we find in the study and that we model is that these lost earnings and these lost taxes are very significant costs for both students and governments, and so they're really important to take into account when we're thinking about the overall financial incentives to invest in skills or not. And we compare these costs as well to the returns to skills, and here we take quite a narrow view of the returns to skills. We really focus on wages, on the higher wages that better educated will earn over the rest of their lives. So we look at higher wages for individuals, but we also say that if individuals are earning higher wages, then the government's able to tax those wages, that labor income, and they'll get higher tax revenue as well. So again, the tax system plays a key role here in our modeling, and we use the OECD's tax model to say, okay, well, how much higher tax revenue will governments get, and what's the higher after-tax income that students will get? And it's important to say that we're not taking into account a lot of other benefits that accrue when skills investments are made. So things like employment, well-being, better health outcomes, better productivity and growth outcomes. We're not looking at those. So if anything, we're probably underestimating the returns to skills for students and governments, not overestimating them. And that'll be important later on. So when we're looking at these costs and returns, we focus on a series of stylized skills investment scenarios to fix ideas. And so why, you'll see the four stylized investment scenarios there. Why do we focus on these different scenarios, and why is it important to vary these different factors? Well, for example, a four-year education, a four-year tertiary education, our first scenario is going to be more expensive in terms of tuition fees for an individual, but it's also going to be more expensive because the individual is going to be out of the labor market for longer. By contrast, someone who's maybe a little bit older might be earning a little bit more, and so they might face larger costs because they have higher wages, and the government might face larger tax revenue costs because there's higher lost tax revenue when that person invests in skills. So the costs can be different, but also the returns can be different. If, for example, someone's making a skills investment when they're younger, they have longer in the labor market in front of them. And that means that they have longer that they can recoup the benefits of those skills investments in terms of higher wages. By contrast, somebody who's maybe a little bit older will have fewer years in which to recoup the cost of their skills investment. And that can change the picture of the financial incentives surrounding the skills investment. And that's something we try to get out of the study. So to look at one of the first sets of results in the study, and as David mentioned, these are all online, one of the key investments, or one of the key innovations in the study is that we take an explicit account for government's use of tax expenditures, tax breaks, tax incentives to encourage skills investments. So when we think about government support for skills, we often think about, government's paying university salaries, for example, government's paying for scholarship income, government's paying for student grants, but tax incentives can often be used as well by governments to try and help people invest in skills. And often these tax incentives aren't as well understood, they're harder to measure, and so they're not as well understood as a form of government support for skills. What we see here is that there's a wide variety of tax incentives that are there, and it also varies widely across OECD countries. Different countries support skills through their tax systems more or less. So taking into account these tax incentives, as well as the overall tax picture surrounding skills, we show this measure of the average effective tax rate on skills. And this takes into account, on one hand, the tax incentives and other government supports for skills through the tax system, but it also takes into account the fact that when skills investments are made and when wages rise after a skills investment, some of those wage increases are taxed away. So labor income tax can reduce the incentives to invest in skills because these wages are taxed away. And so factoring in all of these different issues, we're able to arrive at an overall picture of what the tax burden is on skills investment in these OECD countries for each of our stylized scenarios. And the one that you're seeing here is for a typical tertiary education scenario. And we can see that in some of these countries that the tax rate on skills is pretty high, and indeed it's comparable to some of the tax rates that are out there in the literature on physical capital. So we think this is a really important thing to bear in mind when designing tax policy, that we're not just designing tax policy with physical capital in mind, but when we're designing labor income taxes, we're also bearing in mind the impact of those taxes on skills investment. Now, the other side of the fact that, the tax system taxes away the returns to skills, that means that tax revenue accrues to the government. And in doing so, it covers the costs of the government's investment in skills. The government earn back a return on whatever they're spending on skills in the form of, paying for educational institutions, paying teacher salaries, etc. And so what we do is we try to calculate that for these stylized scenarios. And again, as I said before, it's really important to understand that this is a narrow estimate of the returns to skills because we're only focusing on income tax. We're not focusing on other tax categories. We're not focusing on higher employment, higher growth, higher productivity, which are also better well-being, which are also other important returns to skills. And what we find is that even in terms of just income tax alone, governments can expect to recoup the cost of their skills investments over each individual's life. The tax revenue that an individual will pay after, for example, a tertiary education will cover the cost of that education from the government's perspective. We think that's really important. And you can see that that's true on average. It's not true for all of the countries that we look at. In some countries, the countries on the right-hand side of the graph see really high returns to skills in the form of tax revenue. And in some other countries, you're not seeing that. Now, this doesn't mean that the skills investments don't pay for themselves. They probably still do overall, and I'll show that in a second. It just means that the government may not be recouping its share of the skills investment. So for example, they may be getting a higher return on skills, they may be bearing a higher share of the costs than they're getting in returns, or they may be over-subsidizing the cost but not really getting a lot of the returns due to the tax system. This highlights the role of the tax system in sharing out both the costs and the benefits of skills investments. So moving away from looking at skills investments from the government's perspective, we can now look at the same thing from the student's perspective. How did they make out from their skills investments on average in OECD countries? And we do this by asking the question, well, how much do wages need to rise for a student to cover the cost of the skills investment over their remaining years in the workforce? And so that's shown here in this figure by these gray circles. And we call this the required break-even earnings premium. How much do earnings need to rise for someone, a 17-year-old, to make back the cost of a university education over their remaining years in the workforce? And then we can see that the blue diamonds above the gray circles show, well, how much will the student expect to make? What are students making in terms of a skill premium, a higher wage premium, because they have better skills? What are they making now? And we can see that it's a lot higher than what they need to break even. Skills investments are really profitable for students. And we can see that in some countries, those on the right-hand side of the graph, students really earn a very high share of the returns from skills. Skills are a great investment for students. And that, there's different reasons why that might be the case. In some countries, there's big skill shortages. Skills are very profitable in the labor market. But also in some countries, governments are funding a lot of the skills investments, but they might not be taxing away as many of the returns. Now, so something that again shows the extent to which the skills investments, the returns are shared between the students and the government. So, what's the overall message from this analysis? We try to highlight here that better skills lead to higher wages, and that accrues to individuals, but it also means higher tax revenues for governments. So we see that on average, tertiary education pays for governments and for students, even when we're looking at this narrow income tax focus. So the study provides data support for education spending. Education spending makes sense. And now that's not necessarily true that much more education spending is true for all countries and all kinds of education because the returns vary. So as I mentioned, another thing that we look at as part of the study is these skills tax expenditures, tax support for skills over and above direct support for skills, such as through government education spending or through scholarship spending. And so we asked as part of the study, well, how effective are these skills tax expenditures? How effective is it to try to support skills through the tax system? And the answer is, broadly speaking, not very. We find that direct support for skills is probably a better way to go about trying to increase the levels of skills in society than trying to do it through the tax system. Why? Because often skills tax expenditures can be regressive. They benefit people on the higher incomes or the lower incomes. They often don't support the right kinds of skills investments, and even they may reduce labor market flexibility because they provide extra support for people in their current career, but they don't provide as much support for people who need to change careers or get new skills in response to changes in the labor market. So finally, we consider the broader tax system from a skills perspective. And here we go back to the point that there's a lot of information and analysis and commentary out there about the impact of taxes on physical capital and on investment in things like machines, roads, bridges, factory equipment, etc. But we don't think as much about what the tax system means for skills investment. And we think this is a really important part of the overall picture in terms of jobs, wages, inclusive growth. What we've seen here is the tax system shares the returns between the students and the government. And what this means is that you need to design your tax systems with skills in mind to make sure that the incentives to invest in skills are there for students. And if the tax system is taxing away the returns to skills, then we need to make sure that we're financially supporting students to make skills investments in other ways, through scholarships, through loans, or through spending. And we also show that it makes financial sense to do this. The returns to skills are there in OECD countries at the moment for both individuals and for government. And I think on that point, I'm going to pass back to David.
Well, thanks very much, Piers. You can see how much work has gone into this tax policy study. For those of you that may have joined after we commenced, can I just remind everyone that if you have any questions, please send them to Eric Magnuson and he will forward them on to us. And if we have time at the conclusion, we will seek to answer those questions. Can I, just before I hand over to you, Deborah, clearly a key part of the work that Piers has undertaken has focused on the financing of skills investments. Perhaps you could give us a little bit of a sense of the context within which that work is situated, particularly in terms of the broader issue of how financing fits into the broader question of investment of skills.
Sure, thank you very much, David, and hello, everybody. First, let me say how much from the skills, education and skills, I'm sorry, I'm going too fast on the PowerPoint, to say how much from the education and skills perspective we welcome this work. We're not tax experts, but from where we sit, it sheds very important new light on the connection between skills and financing of skills, how to make sure that the investments in skills actually do pay off. And I think if I can highlight something which, for me, from an education and skills point of view, is really important. For the first time, this work provides us with one tool that allows us to consider the cost of the net cost and the incentives to invest in skills through different sorts of channels at different ages and stages. And we saw the 4 scenarios and case studies that have been modeled in this work, but I think it provides potential to do much more, and this is actually really something we haven't had before. So I know it's been a tremendous investment from the Centre for Tax Policy Administration, but it's one that I think will really pay off for all of us in understanding how to connect these financing issues with skills development. Where it really helps us is to have the essential discussions we need to have about what types of skills investments pay off, for whom, and when, and through what particular mechanisms. I think that's very, very important for those of us working on education and skills to have the data that enables us to understand what's going on and where the investments actually pay off. I think it also allows us to face up to the fact that actually some skills investments do not pay off. And we have to, at least in financial terms, and we have to be aware of that and understand why that happens, and also to understand that some policies, some financing mechanisms aren't actually very effective. We might want them to work, but in fact they don't. And so it enables us to have that discussion about how to really encourage effective investments in skills. So I think that the study has been very helpful in this. It really illustrates the interconnectedness between the role that education and skills plays in securing future strong tax revenue, but also the way in which that tax revenue supports the public investment in skills. And I think that that's a really important interconnection to make. I think also it underscores the role that tax plays in shaping the incentives that people have, that individuals, that firms, and governments have for investing in skills, and it can provide the sustainable funding basis for those skills investments. But it also highlights something which is very important for the work that we're doing, the need to connect together the finance and education ministries, skills development ministries, to find the right mix of tax policies and skills policies so that they're working together to achieve better outcomes rather than working each in their own corner and perhaps undermining each other's effectiveness. So I think that that's something that's very important, and work that Pierce and I have been doing along with many colleagues, and that really helps us to bring all these different policy perspectives together is the work we've been doing with countries on effective national skills policies to get more coherent, consistent policies so that we can actually help countries achieve economic and social outcomes that they are looking for, because that's really, at the end of the day, what it's all about. These projects that we've been doing to date with around 10 countries, and you can see the countries we've worked with on the slide, they really emphasize and foster collaboration across the ministerial portfolios so that we can get more coherent policy settings across ministerial portfolios, but also between different levels of government, and engaging all the relevant stakeholders. So that really helps us to see how these policies all interconnect so that we get effective investment in human capital and investment in human capital that leads to better economic and social outcomes. And just lastly to say that the involvement of the Ministries of Finance in these projects has actually been really valuable because it highlights the importance of designing those tax policies with skills in mind so that we also are able to provide solid financing for skills. Because if we can't finance the investments that countries want to make and expect to make and need to make for future economic success and also future social outcomes, then if we can't finance them, it isn't going to happen. So that's why we all have to work together to help to make that happen, and having the evidence about what is actually going on and where the returns are actually able to be generated, I think helps us enormously in that. So we're very, very happy to be part of this project and to be able to see this come to fruition. So thanks.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much, Deborah. And I see that a number of questions are coming in. Before I go to the first question, just want to pick up on one of the points that Deborah made. And I think that one of the powerful aspects of this work is that it really does present a very compelling case for finance ministers for investment in skills and education. And obviously we all are very much aware of the broader benefits of investing in education and skills. But when you're able to drill down and see the tax benefits that will accrue, the revenue benefits that will accrue to government, you see that all of those other benefits no doubt will flow. But in terms of government expenditure and that return coming in through tax dollars, it even makes sense in that respect. Piers, if I can perhaps turn to one of the first question that has come in. The question is, firstly, does the study incorporate subnational tax incentives into the cost-benefit analysis? And also, does the information on slides 11 and 12, which I'm not entirely sure which slides they were,
These two.
11 and 12, does that mean that it is better for governments to offer access to skills training, that is, to invest in offering free programs, rather than to give tax incentives to join paid programs? So perhaps if you start with the subnational incentives.
We, in answer to the question, we don't incorporate all of the subnational tax incentives, and that matters differently for different countries. Skills models are based on the OECD's tax and wages models, and what they do is that where there is a lot of subnational policy making that matters, we take a sample region or a sample area. So, for example, I think in Switzerland we use the canton of Zurich as a sample canton. So we're getting some of the subnational incentives, but a lot of in some countries there is a lot of skills incentives that happen at the subnational level, and we're taking a representative case, but we mightn't get the full variation. The second issue is on tax incentives and whether it's better to offer free programs than to give tax incentives. The issue behind tax incentives, we tend to be a little bit skeptical about their effectiveness for a couple of reasons. First, tax incentives, especially in income tax, work if someone has income tax liability, and that's a really important point. So if, for example, people on low incomes who may not be in the tax net, they may not get a benefit of tax incentives because they might not have tax liability to begin with. So the people who might benefit more will be people on higher incomes, and those people might not have as acute a need for better skills as people on lower incomes. So a dollar of spending through a tax incentive may not be as effective as a dollar of direct spending. And that doesn't mean the program should be free, but we do think that it may often be better to subsidize the cost of a program directly than to try to help people recoup those costs through tax incentives.
And I think clearly refundable tax credits would be more effective and better able to be targeted than tax deductions, which clearly favour those that have higher incomes that get the benefit of that deduction.
Yeah.
I think one of the other things that comes through very strongly is the benefits of mechanisms such as income contingent loans. I think that as an Australian, I'm very conscious of the system that is in place in Australia, but we do see there that this can be quite an effective way of sharing the costs of that investment, but in a way that does not impede the entry into that study for students that may be cash or credit constrained at the early stages of their study. So that was an interesting finding as well.
That's right.
There are a number of other questions. I'll move on to those. I have a question for you, Deborah. The question relates to the 4 scenarios that Pierce had described for the case studies within the study. And the question is, as people are living and working longer, why do we stop at 50-year-olds? I guess that's probably more a question in the first instance to you, Pierce. And then the question goes on, do you presume that 60-year-olds would be in the same range as 50-year-olds, or as their contribution will be less, does the model take that into account to adjust for this? And then the follow-up question to you, Deborah, is that you said that some skills investments are not worth investing in. Could you perhaps give some examples of that? But Pierce, if you could first take that those first elements of the question.
So we, as regards to the 50-year-olds, in the study, we vary the ages of the people that we analyze, and so we try and see like how do the incentives to invest in skills vary depending on the age. And we see that they vary a lot, and the key logic for us is that we're modeling the returns to skills through wages and through work in the labour market. And so a potential problem for older workers who want to invest in their skills is that they probably have fewer years left in the labour market. So that means that their incentives to invest in skills are a little bit lower, because it's harder for them to make back those costs over their remaining years in the labour market. So that's a challenge for incentivizing older workers to invest in skills that I think is really important and really needs to be looked at further. Now, the question is absolutely right that people are living and working longer, and so the flip side of this is that as people plan to be in the labour market longer, the incentives to invest in skills are more and more. People know that they are going to be around for longer, and so they have greater incentives to invest in skills and keep their skills up to date. So there's a sense in which I think one hand washes the other, that by making people invest in their skills, you can keep them in the labour market, and then also if they're going to be in the labour market, they know they need to invest in their skills. So you can have some virtuous cycles going on.
If I can pick up on the question about some skills investments do not pay off, at least in financial terms. And I think this is a very important insight from the study, because first of all, it enables us to look at why it is that some skills investments do not pay off. What is it that's the factor that matters? That's already an important insight. The second important thing to remember is that investment in skills is not always just about generating a financial return. And I think one of the things that I would really underscore is the importance of ensuring that we invest in bringing everybody's skills up to the level that they're able to participate actively in society. And one of the things that we've found from the PIAC survey of adult skills is that those adults who have low literacy or low numeracy skills find it harder to participate in society, because particularly if they're expected to be able to participate in online services, and they don't have the digital skills or the literacy skills, if they don't have the sort of numeracy skills that enable them to understand basic financial literacy concepts and make sure that they're not being offered a bad deal, for example, then investing in raising their skills may not pay off financially or in terms of greater tax revenue, but if it enables them to participate more effectively in society, that's still an important outcome for societies as a whole. But to have that discussion with a clear understanding of what the data shows about the financial returns is an important part of the equation.
Yes. Something I'd add to that is that we don't just look at the financial returns in terms of what happens after a person makes a skills investment. We also say, well, what would be the extra skills investment that you'll get from an extra $100 of spending? So, for example, another issue that goes to the tax incentives is that we've seen in some studies that, you know, a large tax incentive or a generous tax incentive actually won't move the needle that much in terms of getting people to actually invest in training, whereas other measures like a voucher or a subsidized loan will have a bigger impact. And so one of the things that we have to ask is, how can we get people to actually make the right investments so that we're putting our money to good use? And that's even aside from the you know, the fact of how much it pays once people's made the investment. Does this money help people really make those investments or not?
Okay. Quite a few questions coming in from all around the world, so thank you very much for your interest. We have another question for you, Piers. This question relates to the issue of brain drain. Do the results on tax returns account for the case of countries with a huge brain drain for graduates of higher education?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and thank you for pointing that out. The short answer is no. That we don't. We assume that everybody stays in the country and that the government recoups the returns. Now, trying to factor in brain drain is really important because it's not just that, you know, some countries are losing skilled workers, other countries are gaining skilled workers. And so something that I think is really important is, number one, to understand that, you know, maybe I'm losing some skilled workers, but maybe I'm gaining some skilled workers from somewhere else. So even brain drain doesn't necessarily remove the incentives for governments to invest in skills. There's still benefits there. And it's also another important thing is that brain drain can be beneficial for productivity in a country, because oftentimes after people leave, they come back. And so those two factors are important to bear in mind, because I think that the narrative out there when we normally think about financial incentives is that, well, if people leave, we're not getting any benefits from our skills investments that we've made, and that may be true, but it mightn't be quite as true as people realize.
If I can just add to that point on the brain drain, I think for countries that face this challenge, one of the ways that this tool could help is to think more carefully about the alternative ways in which the government can deliver its support, so that, for example, if the support is delivered by direct payment of university costs, then if somebody leaves, it's not possible to recoup that in the same way as you could if it's through an income contingent loan, where increasingly countries have mechanisms in place to recoup the payments if somebody is offshore.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. There's another question here about coordination between ministries, and this is for you, Deborah. You mentioned that this issue of coordination between ministries, I think in particular between education and finance ministries. We're not going to ask you to name and shame anyone, but the questioner has asked whether or not there are any examples that you can cite of where countries have done this particularly well.
I hesitate, first of all, to say that during my public service career, I have worked in both education ministries and finance ministry before joining the OECD. I think one of the lessons that we've taken out of our work on with countries on national skills strategies is that it's always challenging for countries at the start to look at ways of working in to get more coherent policy settings and more coherent policy outcomes. But everywhere where we have done it, it's paid off, and the people we have worked with in the different countries, from the different ministries, have all ended up very enthusiastic about the process and the outcomes at the end of the process. So I think that's very encouraging. It indicates the value that countries can get from taking a more joined-up approach to policy making.
And I think part of the work that we've done in terms of as part of the national skills strategies has been really bringing your perspective, from as a tax person or as an education person, and helping the other ministries or the other stakeholders to kind of speak your language. And that's an important part of the work that we've done. Once people understand, for example, how important education can be for tax, or vice versa, I think they really understand this need to integrate the different perspectives.
We have a question here from Brazil. In Brazil, there is a heavy taxation on labour. Taxation proportional to the wages amounts. What are the consequences of these tax strategies? I think the question there is going to the extent to which labour is taxed. I guess one point worth making is that some labour taxes are not taken into account in this study as a form of social security contributions. Is there anything else that you can tell us? Perhaps in responding to this question, you might be able to talk a little bit about the different approaches that countries take to try and recoup those costs. Some, for example, do it very much through a heavily progressive personal income tax system. Others do it in other ways. Is there anything you can do? It might even be worth going back to the slide that shows the differences across countries, and to perhaps talk us through some of those. If we can
we just go back to slide? Oh,
I'm thinking actually maybe the one in front of that.
That one. Here. Yeah.
No, that's the sorry, back. It's not that one.
Here. So I think the important thing to say is that while the income tax system taxes away the returns to skills, there are also ways in which it can subsidize the cost of skills, because if I'm not working, I'm also paying less tax. And so in that way, the government, the tax system also offsets parts of the cost of skills, and that leads to some results that might not be as expected. You see similar things in some countries that reduce taxes on student labor. So in that way, because some people work part-time when they're undertaking a skills investment, those reduced taxes on student labor can be effective in terms of allowing people to get the finance to make skills investments that they wouldn't make otherwise. And that's particularly true. One of the things that we saw as we were doing this work is that a lot of countries use social contributions, particularly to try to incentivize skills investments for people in universities, for example. So the results do change when you take those social contributions into account, and that's something that we've actually published some follow-up results this week. When there is heavy taxation on labour, I think the important thing to say is that what that means is that the government is recouping the returns to skills. If the government's taxing labour, it's taxing wages, and wages are returns to skills, so the government's getting its share of the costs. And so what that means is that the government needs to be the government's getting its share of the benefits because of this extra tax revenue, and so it needs to be making sure that it's paying its share of the costs as well. And so what this graph here shows is that countries vary in terms of what share of the costs and returns do they pay. And so some countries, essentially say to students, we'll pay a lot of the costs, but you can keep the returns. And then in other cases, countries say to students, well, you'll pay a lot of the costs, but we'll save maybe slightly more of the returns. And that shows the overall interplay of the tax system and the spending system in terms of generating these financial incentives to invest in skills. So what I would say is that if you're making a choice to levy a very progressive or a very heavy tax burden, you need to make sure that you're providing the support for skills through scholarships, through income contingent loans, or through spending.
Okay. Another question that has come in is asking whether or not the modalities for training have any impact. For example, online delivery versus other forms of delivery. And the question is, does the model take that into account in terms of more costly versus less costly forms of training?
So the short answer is no. We look at kind of broad country averages of what the costs are, and so yeah, we one of the things we look at, and one of the examples is in-work training, and so we focus on how that can be both very expensive, because it can be very expensive for people later in life to take time out of work to engage in those skills investments, and so that causes the financial incentives to be taken away compared to people who are younger, and so maybe their earnings potential isn't as developed. It's easier for those people to invest in their skills for later, and so those are areas where I guess online training can be very important.
I guess if I can just add that one of the key factors to remember is that the opportunity cost of foregone income is almost always much higher than the direct cost of paying for an educational training program, and that's even the case in higher education with people undertaking university degrees. When they're young, there's still an opportunity cost, and that will be typically much higher than the tuition fees that students pay.
I think that's a very important thing to bear in mind when we're talking about access to education, that there's a sense that where there's no tuition fees, people talk about education, like tertiary education, as if it's free. But the fact that there's no kind of sticker price doesn't mean that everybody can afford to go, because of this opportunity cost, which is, as Deborah says, can be very substantial. And so that's why it's important to provide people with the ability to support themselves while they're in education through loans or through scholarships.
Okay. We're running out of time. There are a number of questions here, so I think I will have to select one. Does higher investments in skills increase costs? This may lead to financing of those costs with student loans. Does this not prevent higher education students from not reaching financial freedom quicker? And often financial debt result in more government welfare payments that eventually deplete government tax revenue. So there's quite a few elements to that question. Piers, would you like to have a go at that?
Yeah, that's it. What's nice about the question is it illustrates really how many moving parts there are to the overall skills financing picture, and that's part of the value of the study. Is it kind of brings all those different parts together. So just to go back to the Australia example that you mentioned, one of the nice features of that was that it wasn't just subsidized student loans. The repayments were income contingent. So those on low incomes were not paying back their student loans. The government was subsidizing those skills costs, and I think that's really important. But for people who are earning higher incomes, I don't think it's necessarily a disincentive to have this student debt, because we know from the data that the skills investment pays for itself. And I think that's really important to bear in mind, that it's okay to borrow now to finance a skills investment that you know is going to pay off. And that if the government is bearing that share of the risk through the income contingent system, it can work out for both.
That's I think that's a good point. Now I think we're running up against the end of the time limitations that we have. So I might wrap things up at this point. I'd like to firstly thank you, Piers, for the work that you've done in presenting this very significant piece of work. I know that, as Deborah indicated, her team are drawing upon much of this work in their analysis and policy recommendations being made to government. And I know that the modelling that has been built will be the basis for ongoing work in the future as well. Can I just draw your attention to the slide that is on the screen at the moment? We have there a link to a range of materials that have been produced as part of this project. So for each of the 29 countries that are covered in this study, we have a country note, and that is particularly interesting for when you want to have a look at the details for your country and get a country comparison. So I'd encourage you to have a look at the country notes. There's also the opportunity to do a country comparison on the data visualization tool that is on the website. And there is a brochure. I have a copy of the brochure here with me, which is a very, very nice summary of the document. But for those of you that are interested in the detail, the full tax policy study is also available on the website. I'd encourage you to have a look at that. And I would conclude by not only thanking our panellists, but thanking you all for your participation. For those of you that have joined us from further afield and in difficult time zones, we especially thank you. And if you have any further questions or you'd like to exchange with us, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.